Under the cover of twilight, the shack behind the feed store reeked of sweat, kerosene, and silence that had been bought too cheap. Clara's wrists were red from the iron cuffs her mother had slapped on an hour earlier. Her swollen belly heaved as she sat on the dirt floor, refusing to look anyone in the eye. 8 months gone, and you ain't thought she needs a doctor. Elias's voice cut through the room, low and gravelly. Not angry, not kind, just tired. She needs a husband, not a damn sawbones, spat the older woman, her cracked lips curling as she shifted her weight from one muddy boot to the other. A man. Like you ought to know the difference. I do not need a wife, Elias said, his eyes not on Clara, but somewhere behind her, as if seeing ghosts in the wood-grain walls. I need quiet. The exchange was made without further noise. 2 silver coins, dull and old, 1 jug of whiskey, and a promissory note for half a butchered steer come fall. The mother unlatched the cuffs like she was untying a sack of potatoes and pushed Clara toward the door. Don't give him trouble, she muttered. He paid more than you're worth. Elias did not touch her. He only nodded toward the waiting horse, its mane slick with sweat. Clara climbed up slowly, her eyes burning, her throat sore from not crying. The ride to his homestead was silent, but for the wind. It was 3 miles through dust-choked trails and pine-lined shadows that seemed to breathe. His house sat at the edge of nothing. No neighbors, no fences, just wild land and a porch that looked like it had not heard laughter in a decade. He helped her down, motioned toward the door. Inside, the air was clean, too clean. No scent of tobacco, no perfume, only wood smoke and lemon oil. A single photograph hung crooked over the mantel. A woman with bright eyes and hands wrapped around a baby blanket. The child was missing. You can stay here, Elias said, pointing to a room on the left. The bed is firm. There's water by the stove. I won't come in without knocking. Clara didn't speak. Her fingers hovered near the hidden fold of her boot where she'd sewn in a thin blade days ago. She nodded once and stepped inside. The room smelled of lavender and dust. The bed was covered in a quilt too fine for the rest of the house. A brush, a mirror, and a pair of unused shoes sat neatly beside the dresser. It was not a prison, but it felt like one. Later that night, long after the coyotes started singing to the stars, Clara lay awake, one hand on her belly, the other wrapped around the hilt of the dagger. The baby kicked, her breath caught. She listened for footsteps. Nothing, just wind and the occasional creak of the old beam settling. Around midnight, she slipped out from under the quilt, careful not to make the boards groan. The knife was small, but sharp. She slid it free and crept barefoot toward the front room. No light, no sound. Her heart beat like a drum in her ears. She moved to the porch. Rain had begun to fall, thin, cold, whispering. She saw him then, not in bed, not watching her, but kneeling on the wooden boards, an oil lamp guttering beside him. Elias was threading new leather into a torn saddle. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his hands steady. The rain soaked. His shirt dripped from his hair. He did not notice her. He spoke softly to no one. She always said this place needed mending. She meant more than the fence. Clara stood frozen, the knife hanging useless by her side. He looked up finally, seeing her, and said only, "Could not sleep." She shook her head. He nodded once, then returned to the saddle, stitching through the quiet. Back in her room, Clara hid the knife under the pillow. Not out of trust, not yet, but out of something more complex, something that hurt less than fear. In the morning, he left bread and blackberry. Jam on the table, no note, no questions, just bread and silence, the kind that wasn't heavy for once, just still. The morning sun spilled through the lace curtains of the room Elias had given her, casting soft golden shadows across the hand-stitched quilt. Clara sat upright, the scent of dried lavender still clinging to the corners, mixing with something older, cedar, faint rose petals, and time. The room had not been changed in years. A hoop of unfinished embroidery sat on the windowsill, thread trailing like a forgotten promise. Beside it, a book of psalms, worn thin with use. In the center of the far wall, a portrait hung slightly tilted, a woman no older than Clara herself, with dark hair pinned neatly and a quiet look in her eyes, not smiling, not sad, just waiting. Elias never entered the room. Each morning she woke to warm cornbread left outside her door, a kettle already singing on the stove. Some days, there were extra firewood bundles neatly stacked, a clean dress mended and folded at the end of her bed. He said little, just nodded when she passed. At night, the house was still, the only sound the tick of the mantel clock and the faint crackle of firewood settling into ash. Clara had lived in homes where yelling filled the walls, where hunger paced the floors, where silence was sharp and angry. But this silence was different. It did not watch her with suspicion. It let her breathe. One afternoon, as the wind shifted and clouds gathered low over the valley, a sharp knock startled Clara while she peeled carrots by the open window. Elias opened the door before she could react. A woman in a black bonnet stood outside, mud caked up her boots, her jaw set like stone. "Martha," Elias said, his voice even. "I came for eggs," the woman snapped, her eyes sliding past him to Clara, "and to see this girl you brought in." Clara instinctively stepped back, the roundness of her belly unmistakable even under the shawl. "Well," Martha hissed, hands on her hips, "ain't she ripe? Barely grown herself and already swelled up like a fall pumpkin. What's the matter, Elias? Town too quiet without a scandal?" Elias didn't move. "She your new pet, Martha," she spat. "Didn't take long, did it? After burying your wife, now you bring in some barefoot hussy from the flats. You always did like 'em young." Clara froze. The knife in her hand trembled slightly, but Elias simply looked at the woman, his jaw set. "You want eggs," he said. "Take them." He turned, walked into the kitchen, and came back with a small basket. He held it out without a word. Martha snatched it, her eyes still burning holes through Clara. "She won't last, you know. Trash never does." Still, Elias said nothing. He stepped back, placed one hand gently on the door, and closed it. Not slammed, just closed. The click echoed in the silence that followed. Clara stood for a long time after Martha left. Her fingers rested on her belly, the child stirring inside. She waited for Elias to explain, to apologize, to tell her she was not what that woman said. But he didn't. He returned to the porch, took his place on the worn wooden rocker, and began whittling a piece of cedar without looking up. He had not defended her. He had not denied it. He had just shut the door. That night, Clara sat at the edge of the bed, brushing out her hair in front of the mirror. Behind her, the portrait of the other woman, the wife, watched in stillness. Clara whispered to it, almost, without meaning to, "He's more afraid of their words than mine." And she realized then he had not bought her to save her. He had bought her because he had stopped believing in his own worth, because ghosts were easier than people, because silence could not accuse him of anything. But she was not a ghost. She was still alive, and her child would be too. The wind howled like something feral that night, rattling the shutters and creeping through the floorboards like cold fingers looking for warmth. Clara lay in bed, eyes open, muscles tense. Every creak of the house fed her unease. She had counted the days, nearly 2 weeks since her mother sold her off like livestock. Elias had not touched her, not even spoken more than necessary, but the silence was no longer comforting. It felt like waiting for a rope to tighten. She rose without lighting the lamp, dressing quietly in the long coat Elias had left hanging. On the peg, the blade tucked in her boot pressed against her ankle, a grim reminder that freedom always came with a price. She pulled on thick socks, wrapped her shawl tightly, and stepped out through the back door. The cold hit her like a slap. Snow had started falling, light but fast, piling over the cracked stone path. She pressed on through the wind, teeth clenched against the sharp bite of air, her boots crunching softly. She did not know where she was going, only that it had to be away. Away from the house with the silent man, away from the whispers, away from the ghost of a woman in every corner of that bedroom. But a sudden twist of pain in her side stopped her mid-step. She gasped, grabbing the railing for balance. Another jolt, lower this time and stronger. She doubled over, the snow stinging her knees as she fell. Her breath came in short bursts, fogging in the dark. "No," she whispered, pressing her palm to the taut curve of her belly. "Not now, please, not now." A sound, footsteps heavy and fast, then Elias's voice, rough with urgency. "Clara." She did not answer. She could not. The pain surged again. Then his hands were under her, lifting her with ease, her body pressed against the soaked wool of his coat. He carried her back into the house without a word, straight past the fire into the warmth of the quilted bed. He knelt beside her, his face flushed from the cold, and placed a calloused hand on her stomach. His voice, when it came, was low and strained. "Do not let your child die because of what people say." His words struck her like thunder in a quiet sky. She stared at him, unable to look away. In that moment, he was not the silent man who avoided questions. He was someone else, someone who knew what it meant to lose. Later, when the pain dulled and her breath returned to normal, Clara spoke for the first time about her past. "She wanted me to serve drinks," she said, eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. "To pour whiskey and sit on laps and smile. Like nothing mattered. The miners paid better if the girl was pretty." She paused, fingers gripping the edge of the quilt. "I said no, once, just once. She locked me in the goat shed for 2 nights. After that I stopped saying no." Elias said, "Nothing." He just stared into the fire, shoulders tense. "I ran," Clara continued, "found a job cleaning sheets at a boarding house in Dry Creek. That's where I met him, the father. He was kind until he was not." She looked at Elias. "I do not even know. If he knows, I do not know if I want him to." Elias nodded once, slowly. Then he rose, set a fresh log on the fire, and left her to sleep. But sleep did not come easy. Clara drifted in and out of half-dreams. Her mother's voice, the smell of whiskey, the weight of a man's breath on her skin. Sometime after midnight, she woke with a start. There was a sound, faint, heartbreaking crying. She sat up, breath caught in her throat. The baby. No, it was coming from outside her room. She rose quietly, walked toward the source, and stopped at the end of the hallway. Through the open doorway, she saw Elias seated by the front window, the moonlight tracing silver lines across his face. In his lap lay a tiny dress, pink, hand-stitched, delicate as a sigh. He held it like one would hold a memory they were afraid to break. "She made it after the 3rd, Elias said softly without turning. "Still believed it'd be different next time." Clara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "The 3rd what?" "The 3rd loss," he said. "She lost 7. I buried each of them behind the ridge. Boys, girls, we never named them." He traced the hem of the dress with one finger. "I buried this one after the 7th. Could not look at it any more." Clara stood in silence, the air thick with a sorrow that stretched beyond years, beyond words. And in that moment, she understood. He did not shut the world out because he was cruel. He shut it out because it had taken everything he once dared to love. The morning after the crying, the snow had mostly melted, revealing the brown, brittle grass beneath. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching Elias saddle his horse. He moved slow, precise as always, but something had shifted. Last night had changed the quiet between them into something else, no longer made of fear or uncertainty, but of shared sorrow. After he rode off toward town, Clara wrapped herself in her shawl and stepped outside. The wind had softened, the air damp with thaw. She followed the narrow trail behind the barn, boots crunching on half-frozen soil, past the chicken coop and the broken fence. The footprints led her farther than she had ever dared to go, through a thinning grove of pine, up a gentle rise where the trees grew sparse and the sky widened. At the top of the ridge, she saw them, 7 markers, worn and uneven, arranged in a line like forgotten prayers. No names, just numbers crudely etched with a blade into the weathered wood. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She knelt before the last one, the 7th. The earth there was newer than the rest, the grass struggling to grow. A single wildflower, stunted and bent from the cold, leaned against the marker as if mourning too. She reached out, fingers trembling, and laid her hand on the wood, warm somehow, impossibly warm. And just like that, the tears came, not because of fear or shame or loneliness, but because of the weight of it all, the silence she had mistaken for menace, the grief mistaken for cruelty. Elias was not the man the village whispered about in shadows. He was a man who had buried 7 pieces of hope. She cried for them, for him, for herself. She did not hear him approach, but when she turned, he was there, standing at the edge of the grove, hat in hand, eyes unreadable. He did not speak, did not move, just watched her the way someone watches fire, knowing it can warm or destroy. "I thought you killed her," Clara whispered, her voice thick. "I thought they said—" "I know what they say," Elias replied softly, "and I let them. Why? Because arguing takes more breath than silence." His eyes drifted to the markers, then back to her. Each one took a little more from her and me. By the 7th, there was nothing left. Clara stood slowly, her hand brushing the edge of the wooden cross. "She tried to plant roses here," he said. "Never grew. Soil's too thin. Wind takes the petals." "Maybe. This spring," Clara said, "we try again." For the first time his face shifted, barely a flicker of something almost like disbelief. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods when he hears something he did not realize he needed to hear. They stood there a while longer, beneath the sky that promised more cold before warmth. The ridge felt sacred, not in the way of churches, but in the way of pain remembered and honored. Then, without a word, they walked back down together, steps slow even and side by side. The days lengthened, and the snow began to pull back its icy fingers from the earth. Shoots of stubborn green poked through the frozen ground. The sky no longer a flat grey, but tinged with the pale blue of an approaching spring. Something within the house shifted too, not loudly, but gently, quietly. Clara no longer waited for Elias to leave before stepping outside. She joined him, pulling on gloves, holding nails as he mended the south fence, handing him boards as he patched the roof of the woodshed. She limped a little now, the weight of her belly more pronounced with each week, but she moved with purpose. At noon she cooked corn, stewed beans, rabbit. Elias trapped that morning. Sometimes he spoke, most times he listened, and every evening as the fire crackled and the sky turned from gold to navy, Clara read aloud from the worn Bible that sat in the kitchen hutch, its pages soft from years of turning. She read slowly, pausing to ask questions, to wonder aloud about passages. What does it mean when it says, "Sorrow may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning"? Elias, carving a spoon from hickory in the rocking chair, replied without looking up, "It means sometimes you have to lose something to understand what's worth finding." One afternoon, Clara stood near the porch where Elias tended to a crooked line of wooden stakes running along the fence. She noticed the soil was darkened, turned fresh. Beside each stake sat a bulb, half buried. "You're planting roses again," she said, stepping closer. He glanced up, wiping his hands on a rag. "They won't take, never have." Clara crouched slowly beside one, her hands pressing lightly into the earth. "Then why keep trying?" Elias shrugged. "Because she believed they would," he said. Even the hardest ground gives in if you're patient. Enough. And you? He hesitated, then looked at her fully. I never believed it. But I kept planting because when she looked out and saw them, even the ones that didn't bloom, she smiled like they did. Clara swallowed the lump rising in her throat. She reached for one of the stakes and turned the soil gently, carefully recovering. The bulb. I think she was right. Later that night, as wind whispered against the windows and the warmth from the stove wrapped the room like a blanket, Clara sat at the table, one hand on her stomach. The baby kicked beneath her palm, rhythmic and strong. If it's a girl, she said softly, I'll name her Rose. Elias looked up from his whittling. His eyes met hers, quiet, steady. She'll be stubborn, Clara added. She'll grow where no one thinks she can, even if it takes time. Elias set the carving aside and nodded, not quickly, but with weight. That's a good name, he said, and a better hope. The silence between them that night was no longer a wall, but something shared, like a field waiting for seeds to bloom, like the space between heartbeat and breath. For the first time in weeks, Clara did not dream of the mining town, or her mother's fists, or the smell of whiskey on a stranger's coat. She dreamed of sunlight through rose petals, of small hands tugging her braid, of Elias smiling, not just with his mouth, but with his whole face, as a girl with dirt-streaked cheeks chased chickens through wildflowers. And in the dream, the roses bloomed, not perfectly, not all at once, but enough. The wind that night was different, hot, dry, charged with a stillness that made even the coyotes fall silent. The sky above the ridge had turned a bruised shade of purple, and thunder rolled low, like a warning drum from the heavens. Elias stood on the porch, watching the distant mountains. A flash of lightning lit the horizon, followed seconds later by a crack of thunder so sharp it split the sky. Then came the smell, acid, biting smoke. Clara was setting dishes on the table when the first curl of haze drifted through the open window. She paused, nostrils flaring. The baby moved restlessly. Inside her, as if sensing something was wrong, Elias burst through the door. There's a fire, he said quickly, already reaching for blankets. Up by Briar Ridge, wind's bringing it this way. Clara moved to the door, looking out toward the tree line. Flames flickered on the distant slope like angry stars falling to earth. Need to move, Elias said, shoving cloths into a bucket of water. The old stone hut. North Trail, it's safe. Clara nodded, her heart racing, but as she turned to grab her coat, a sharp pain stabbed through her spine, forcing her to double over. Elias, she gasped, clutching the edge of the table. The baby, he was at her side in seconds, eyes wide. It's time, she whispered, panic rising in her throat. Another contraction hit harder this time, stealing her breath. Smoke thickened around them. The fire was coming fast. Elias did not hesitate. He soaked 2 blankets in the bucket, wrapped one around her shoulders and the other around himself. Then, with strong arms, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing, cradling her belly against his chest. Hold on, he said, and kicked the door open. Outside, the world had turned orange. Ash floated through the air like snow, and the wind screamed across the field, carrying sparks with it. The trail to the stone hut twisted through a narrow ravine, half choked with dry brush, and the flames were hungry. But Elias knew the way. He moved fast, breath coming in short bursts, boots thudding over the dry earth. Clara cried out as another contraction racked her body. I cannot, she gasped. I cannot do this. Yes, you can, Elias gritted. Just breathe, hold on to me. The fire was behind them now, but not far. Trees crackled and burst into flame along the ridge. Smoke poured into the trail like a black tide. Clara buried her face into his chest, trying to block the heat, the fear, the pain. Each step jolted her. Each breath tasted of cinders. Then, just as her vision started to fade, they reached it. The old stone hut built into the hillside, part rude cellar, part memory. It had once been a birthing place too long ago when hope had lived inside. Elias kicked the door open, carried her in and set her down on the straw-strewn floor. The walls were cool, thick, untouched by fire. He worked fast, laying her on the blankets, fetching water from the barrel stored inside, lighting a small oil lamp. Outside the fire roared, but the stone muffled the sound to a distant thunder. Clara screamed as another wave hit. Her body buckled. She clutched Elias's hand, nails digging deep. "I am scared," she whispered. "So am I," he said, kneeling beside her. "But you are not alone." Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. It was hard to tell. Pain bled into pain. Elias wiped her brow, whispered encouragement, held her hand through every groan and cry. He had seen death come through childbirth 7 times before, but this time he fought it. He fought it for her. Finally, a silence. Then a final cry, sharp, raw and undeniable. And then, over the sound of wind and crackling brush, came another cry, high-pitched, new, alive. A baby's wail filled the hut. Clara gasped, body shaking. Tears streamed down her face. Elias cradled the small red bundle in his arms, wrapped it tight in cloth, and handed her over. "A girl," he whispered. Clara laughed and cried at once, taking the child into her arms. "Rose," she said. "She's Rose." Outside, the fire began to die. Inside, life had begun. The first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the stone walls, soft and golden, carrying with it the scent of scorched earth and new life. The fire had moved on during the night, its fury reduced to distant smoke trails, rising on the horizon. But its memory still lingered in the air, clinging to skin and breath like a shadow. Inside the hut, however, something brighter had taken root. The baby's cries rang out again, fierce, unrelenting, full of breath and new purpose. It was not the whimper of something fragile, but the cry of something determined to live. It echoed off the stone walls like a hymn, a sound no one had heard in that place before, not for 10 long years, and it shattered the weight of that silence in a single moment. Elias knelt beside Clara, his hands stained with soot and blood, his shoulders trembling, not from fear but from something far more vulnerable, relief. His chest rose and fell in uneven gasps, as if he too had been reborn with the child. He looked down at Clara, who held the newborn to her chest with shaking arms, her face pale with exhaustion and glowing with wonder. There was dirt on her cheeks, sweat on her brow. But her eyes were blazing. The baby, slick with the mess of arrival, squirmed and rooted blindly, searching for warmth, for milk, for a voice she recognized. Her fingers curled in the air like petals unfurling in the sun. Clara looked up at Elias through tears that had yet to dry. "She's strong," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "She's loud," Elias replied hoarsely, a ghost of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The lines in his face softened for a fleeting second, making him look almost young again, like the man he might have been long ago, before sorrow carved its name across his back. He reached out, his hand unsteady, slow, as if approaching something sacred. With a trembling fingertip he brushed the baby's cheek. Her skin was soft, impossibly soft, like silk warmed by firelight. She blinked, eyes still cloudy with the blur of birth, and let out a yawn so small, so human it broke him open. "Rose," he murmured. "She'll be Rose." Clara cradled the infant tighter, her lips pressed to the child's damp hair. "You named her." "No," Elias said quietly. "You did. I just believe it now." He shifted his body, sagging with the weight of what had just passed, and leaned heavily against the stone wall. The smoke had begun to creep in through the cracks again. Thin, pale, almost forgotten, but it clung to them still. Elias's face, streaked with soot, turned grey. His lips were cracked, his eyes dulled. Elias, Clara said. He did not answer. Elias, she said again, louder this time, urgency climbing her spine. The baby whimpered at her chest, sensing the change. Still, nothing. She reached for him with a trembling hand, her fingers closing around his forearm. It was limp, too limp. He slumped sideways, collapsing to the floor like a marionette with its strings cut. "No, no, Elias," she cried, shifting Rose into the crook of her arm and dragging herself toward him. Her knees scraped the stone, her heart pounded so loud it drowned out thought. "Look at me. You stay with me. Do you hear me?" He did not move. She pressed her ear to his chest, her breath held so tight it hurt. There, a sound, faint, shallow, but there. "Please," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his shoulder. "Please don't leave, not now, not when she's here." She shook him once, twice. Still nothing. And then Rose cried, a piercing, angry wail that ripped through the air like thunder. It was not fear or hunger, it was insistence, a call back to life. Elias gasped. His chest rose sharply, then fell. Another breath, rough, rasping, but alive. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. Then they found Clara's face. "She's got lungs," he croaked. Clara laughed, the sound breaking halfway into a sob. "So do you," she said. He smiled faintly, his eyelids fluttering closed again. "Guess I'll need them." Outside, the fire smoldered into memory. The smoke lifted, and inside that battered, soot-blackened hut, the three of them stayed close, wrapped in silence, in breath, in the fragile miracle of survival, bound not by blood, but by the cry that named a child and resurrected a man, bound by a rose that bloomed in the middle of ruin. 1 year later, the house that once stood in silence now hummed with life. The wooden fence was rebuilt, sturdy and straight, wrapped with soft vines and wild grass that had returned with the spring rains. A cradle sat by the front window, carved from cedar and smoothed by hand, where a baby once slept and now stood, learning to walk one wobbling step at a time. The rose bushes by the porch had bloomed, not all of them, not perfectly, but enough. Delicate pink petals opened toward the sun, stubborn and tender. They grew where only failure had lived before. Inside the house, laughter echoed in the kitchen. Clara stirred stew, humming softly as Rose babbled on the floor, clutching a wooden spoon like a scepter. Elias sat at the table, mending a doll's torn arm with the same patience he once used to sew saddles and shoes. Letters came now, wrapped in blue ribbon or tucked inside baskets of cornbread and peach jam. Some were apologies, some were blessings. All came from the same mouths that had once whispered cruelty. They left quilts, socks, even a note scribbled in a child's hand that said, "Sorry for what my mama said." The porch became a gathering place on warm evenings. Sometimes neighbors stopped by, awkward at first, bringing pie or old stories. Clara never asked why they came. She just passed around the tin cups and let them come again. One morning Clara held Rose on her hip, pointing to the flowers by the fence. "She called you Bay yesterday," she said, smiling. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Twice. I counted." He chuckled, that quiet, familiar sound that still made her chest ache in the best way. "She's a clever one," he said. "She's yours," Clara said softly, meaning more than the words. He reached out and touched the child's cheek. "Ours." That evening, as the sun melted into amber across the valley, Rose toddled barefoot through the yard. Her curls bounced with each step. One chubby hand clutched around the stem of a fresh-picked rose. She squealed with delight at a butterfly, stumbled and rose again, undeterred. Clara watched from the porch, her hand resting on her belly, now round once more with new life. Elias stood beside her, his hand gently on her back. The land around them, once scorched and barren, had grown green again, not perfect, not easy, but alive. And as Rose ran, laughing into the golden light, the petals of her rose trailing behind. "Her like blessings," Clara whispered. Some things must be lost to make room for miracles. And even in a place turned to ash, flowers can still bloom. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you felt the quiet strength of a man who thought he had nothing left, the resilience of a young woman rising from betrayal, and the miracle of a rose blooming from ashes, let us know with a like, a comment, or most of all, a subscription. This is Wild West Love Stories, where forgotten romances are brought back to life, where broken hearts learn to beat again, and where miracles grow in the most untamed places. Subscribe to stay with us through every tale of longing, redemption, and love that defied the frontier. And don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss a story where bullets missed, but hearts didn't. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.